One of the most profound individuals to ever put their thoughts on paper was 19th century Russian academic Fyodor Dostoevsky. Known very well by those who have familiarized themselves with the classic works of literature, a lesser known fact is that Fyodor suffered from epilepsy since he was 18, which was theorized to have rapidly worsened around the time of his miraculous near execution in forced labor sentence. This condition, thought in retrospect to be temporal lobe epilepsy, proved to be the source of many terrifying experiences for Dostoevsky across many years of his life. But in an incredible and almost miraculous fashion, these episodes would become the source for an inspiration which to this day has reached the lives of millions of people in some immeasurable ways. This specific form of epilepsy has also been called ecstatic epilepsy, since often accompanying these fits of immense hysterical terror would be a prior state of extreme bliss and allegedly indescribable hyper-awareness. Those effects proved to open so many doors of inspiration and mystical creativity for Dostoevsky that he himself wrote in his works, "I would not exchange this disease for all the treasures in the world." And thanks to these strange yet fascinating insights of this otherworldly significance, we are left across an array of career material with a permanent and arguably the deepest philosophical microscope into the rational human mind, perhaps of all that exists to this day. Yet the intangible value contained within and passed along these writings is impossible to measure, and the impacts of these writings can really only be expressed and integrated on an individual level. So it's worth noting that in our surface level observations, we are likely still just grasping at the true essence of what Fyodor was trying to convey. But for this analysis, we are concerned with just one of Dostoevsky's works, Notes from the Underground, a novella written as a literary response to a prior novel at that time by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. That novel highlighted the prospect of an Enlightenment society ultimately realized by a collective of highly reasoned, self-enlightened determinists. Dostoevsky's response, prior unbeknownst to both himself and Nikolai, would ultimately prove to be such a dismal yet profoundly introspective window into the human psyche that it has not only withstood the test of time, but revealed itself to be of greater depth and psychological insight than he could have possibly predicted. Despite its surprisingly short length, the product in reality could be the source of enough material significance that it could fill an entire semester of class in university. So naturally, this video will never be able to truly convey the countless insights which Dostoevsky was trying to express in this book. Still, we can point to a few themes of his work and explore what exactly makes a creation like this step outside the ordinary bounds of interpersonal expression. And at the end of the day, all philosophy is meant to convey deeply entrenched concepts and intuitions. But in his own way, Fyodor has found a way to accomplish this in such a visceral, intimate fashion that for many people it can be a shock to perceive themselves and humanity in the way that Dostoevsky does. The Underground Man is the self-referred protagonist of the book, who serves as the bitter narrator, reflecting on his woes and reservations about society. The book is effectively split into two parts, the first serving as an incessant internal monologue by the narrator, and the second showing his previous experiences in St. Petersburg society and his interactions with others during his tenure as a Russian civil servant. While the second half is undoubtedly a curious and intriguing journey, the first is where we can find the true lens into Dostoevsky's Underground Man and the disturbing yet compelling implications of what it is he's actually saying. The pleasure of despair, but then, it is in despair that we find the most acute pleasure, especially when we are aware of the hopelessness of the situation. This text, when read just once, might not seem very profound on the surface, And this is a repeating style for Dostoevsky, to layer these implicative queries in a gentle, almost elegant way. But one must take some time and dedicate their full conscious effort in understanding what it is the author could possibly be trying to explain here. It's in despair that we find the most acute pleasure. In what rational world would a phrase like that even make sense? A quote like this is powerful because it does not reveal itself on its face. A quote like this forces the observer, the reader, into the position of the questioner, and the questionee as well, because the real phenomenon is one's challenging of a perception which we are all inclined to feel as conventionally true. But now, in the role of the questioner, we have to ask ourselves, are there any exceptions in light of this question that could render the statement true? Let's explore, for example, could there be situations which we experience of pain, intense emotion, even suffering, where we might surprisingly find ourselves in a state of enhanced being, or of raw aliveness, or surreal awareness, and in a way that is negative only by conventional expectation? Furthermore, is it possible that we not only thrive within these experiences of enhanced awareness, but are drawn towards them as a result of our human nature? Is there anything to be said about us seeking out things which directly make our lives more difficult, yet which ultimately enhance our present experience? Even things such as thrill-seeking, fasting, cold shocks, limit pushing, etc. These are not things seen as intuitively beneficial for humans on their face, but have been utilized since humanity itself to enhance one's present immersion. So if this is, in fact, a truth found within reality of the human experience, might we then see the potential for that to be reflected throughout all of said experience, even out to the bounds of things such as pain or suffering or loss, and even at the point of a seemingly pointless toothache? In actuality, this ailment can just as effectively serve as a reminder, a momentary enhancement to ground our present moment in an inescapable truth and to inform us about the constraints of our reality. And so, the underground man might suggest that this mechanism for staying perpetually in touch with one's fragility, that is, their humanity, can also be a positive force, yet which fails to be apprehended by so many people. Furthermore, as a thought, if we as people do experience a sort of positive pleasure in parallel to this sort of pain, in contrast to those being opposite concepts or exclusive in their very essence, what are the implications of that fact? Might it be that pleasure and pain, to generalize them, are less so dualities as we often romanticize, and instead closer to complementary variables, subordinated to a greater primordial motivation? All these questions are only one branch of the tree that is this book of deep and intertwining concepts. Then there is the underground man's rejection of rational determinism. This was a majorly present worldview in the context of Dostoevsky's time, and now with increasing echoes of sentiment. As we look at the primary themes within the underground man's mind, it's clear that they define a great contradiction with a certain rationalist worldview. That worldview suggests, essentially, that our conscious motives and preferences are ultimately products of complex and objective reason, that this reason is grounded in sources which can be observed and predicted, and therefore if enough humans sufficiently reasoned past a threshold, and that reason was consistent between individuals, then by informing reason in a specific way, determinists could inevitably bring about a utopia. You see, gentlemen, reason is an excellent thing. There's no disputing that. But reason is nothing but reason, and satisfies only the rational side of man's nature, while will is a manifestation of that whole life, that is, of the whole human life, including reason in all the impulses. And although our life in this manifestation of it is often worthless, yet it is life and not simply extracting square roots. This apparent juxtaposition by Dostoevsky denotes an element within us as humans, and it is this very element that is elusive to scholars such as Nicolay, whose vision of reality would ultimately allow for the perfect coordination of human impulse and behavior, a calculated taming, so to speak, in effect to bring about the promised social utopia. And it is almost tragic that this is not the case, since without Dostoevsky's aspect, we might actually have a chance in producing a future completely liberated of suffering and chaos. And through this lens, revealingly, that goal of a perfected utopia is surely a noble and a highly intentioned goal. Yet the only thing separating this philosophy from that of the underground man is the recognition of this almost exotic aspect of human nature. This school of thought, as profound as it was in the 19th century, opens up even more avenues for perception and inquiry in light of the philosophical questions surrounding artificial intelligence and the prospect of its unpredictability in the future. So it would be necessary, if humans ever were to properly understand and project the human mind technologically, to acknowledge and deal with this unknown variable. And it is this technological progression that very well may be the next step in expanding on the roots of the underground man's philosophy. The last theme we can dive into is more obscure in nature, but it lends itself incredibly well to a certain type of mind, a psychological mind, especially the neurotic type of mind. And once you do understand what the underground man is saying and its implications, the doors opened and the questions asked, it can realistically be stressful and difficult to think about these ideas in this way. But this question drives directly into the heart of the concept of action over ideas. And in the underground man's analysis, the truth of one's action cannot immediately be attributed to reason or logic. Rather, it's a stopping block at some point along one's chain of reasoning. And it is the scope of this stopping point which determines man's direct motivation for any given course of action in his life. The underground man, paradoxically, is consciously aware of his necessary course of action in order to attain what might be considered a normal or active existence. However, his full awareness of the chain of rational action extends so far, it is as though it dissolves into nothing, into the semantic, philosophical, and metaphysical level, and at that point it just breaks down. And this is one of the main catalysts for the underground man's philosophy. All action can, if apprehended, be reduced to meaninglessness along a sufficient scale of perception. And when pitted in this overextended perception of one's own life, their action might be reduced to nothing, crushed by the apprehension of his own fragility and arbitrariness. What's the point in making your bed in the morning when you are fully and consciously aware of the fact that the fate of society has been relegated to a cosmic heat death? I repeat, emphatically repeat, ingenious people and active figures are all active simply because they are dull and narrow-minded. How to explain it? Here's how. As a consequence of their narrow-mindedness, they take the most immediate and secondary causes for the primary ones, and thus become more convinced more quickly and easily than others that they have found an indisputable basis for their doings. And so they feel at ease, and that, after all, is the main thing. For in order to begin to act, one must first be completely at ease, so that no more doubts remain. Well, and how am I, for example, to set myself at ease? Where are the primary causes on which I can rest? Where are my bases? Where am I going to get them? This is such an admittedly narcissistic, cynical view of humanity, but the frightening aspect becomes upon closer analysis, in holding a microscope up to the issue, that one can't really dismiss it as untrue. It is not untrue rather than overly true, and offers a revelation that man can become too consciously aware of the opposing forces within himself. And this can be examined and proven past just the ramblings of the underground man. All we need to do is observe the phenomenon which surround us every day. Take simply the reality of war and those who have experienced its horrors. According to a set of studies, we know that 10% of men and 19% of women active service members were diagnosed with PTSD according to the National Center for PTSD. However, 76% of US veterans or active service responders who suffered a physical or mental injury reported to have PTSD, with that number likely being underrepresented due to the widely subjective nature of the disorder and other factors. If one thinks about it though, it's actually miraculous that that number is not higher, given the nature of this type of trauma. We can imagine that if any one person were to be exposed or made fully aware of the extent to which they themselves or others were suffering within just one singular conflict, that knowledge of that potential would be a weight which none of us are capable of bearing. Even the most intense cases of individual trauma are produced by a sliver of the vastness of collective suffering at any given moment. But despite this reality, we strive as a society to help those people and develop resources necessary for integrating them back into society. And in many ways, we can do this very effectively, and in a way that can also be applied to the underground man. Therapy, for example, is a process we use in order to help people develop the psychological tools and mental systems for effectively, or at least less ineffectively, engaging with society. And in trauma therapy, one of those methods consists of redirecting our conscious attention in a productive but restrained way. And it is within that boundary we can create the space to focus on improvement, separated in a way from the incapacitating weight of that terrible knowledge that we have. This knowledge does not go away, but one can learn to exist outside of it. And in an almost identical way, this is the very practice of narrowing one's scope of attention, of restraining one's perception, like the underground man suggests of the direct or the active man. The lesson then should not be under direction of the underground man, but in observing his response to these forces. At the crossroads of debilitating truth, which many of us will face at some point, we'll have three options. They can deny it out of fear or naivety, or they can dwell in its weight in a way that is not necessarily factually wrong, or at least untrue in a certain analysis, but still inhibits the path towards that person's subjective fulfillment. Or alternatively, one can acknowledge the reality as true and necessary, but aim to navigate outside of it and strive in spite of its presence. Our conclusion then is that it can be often beneficial to perpetually narrow one's interaction with reality to what might drive them to be active in a self-sustaining way in a long term. And it is in this way that ignorance truly can be bliss, and it may be a controlled, self-constrained set of impulses that guide us more effectively through life than the curse of a omniscient hyper-awareness. These questions asked by Dostoevsky are difficult to answer, and far from followed up by a neatly presented resolution. But these are necessary things to consider, especially in light of an almost Nietzschean trend towards the concept of an actualized self, and the growing illusion that this substrate on which our conscious minds operate is something that can be so easily understood.